Hello, everybody out there in internet jazz world. I'm the Jazz and Blues audiophile, and today I would like to talk to you about a group that is, I think, highly neglected in most jazz circles. I want to talk about some real good mood jazz, a very special kind of jazz from this group here that we're hearing in the background. And I want to talk about the MJQ, that is, the Modern Jazz Quartet. This is the album that's playing right now. It's a concert that was given in 1960 in Slovenia, in Europe. These guys were really, really big in Europe, the Modern Jazz Quartet. Now, their brand of jazz is very, very different from anything you've been listening to. If you've been listening to any kind of jazz and you never heard their particular brand of jazz, then you're in for a somewhat of a shock, maybe a surprise. A lot of people like the Modern Jazz Quartet or just don't like them at all because they're not your mainstream everyday kind of jazz. They are probably the closest thing to classical music as jazz has had. There's a lot of other jazz men that went close to classical. A lot of European jazz men, of course, actually successfully pretty much married classical music and jazz and jazzed it up. But the Modern Jazz Quartet in the USA, they were one of the first to do it. They were founded in 1952. These guys were four jazz musicians that used to be part of the Duke Ellington, not Duke Ellington, but the Dizzy Gillespie big band. So very, very modern bebop big band. And these guys came out of that band. And basically Milt Jackson and John Lewis on the piano, Milt Jackson on the vibraphone, Connie Kay at the drums, and Percy Heath at the bass. That was basically the Modern Jazz Quartet for 20 years. They never varied in personnel. At the beginning, there was a different drummer. It was Kenny Clark was there. He stayed for about 4 or 5 years, and then he bailed out, and he was replaced by Connie Kay. So that's the four musicians. And these guys, especially under the leadership and the influence of John Lewis. John Lewis had a classical formation on piano. And John Lewis, he's one of the greats. He's one of the true, phenomenal, great pianists in jazz. There's so many great pianists in jazz. You know, when we talk about jazz piano, you know, Oscar Peterson, Bobby Timmons, Billy Taylor, you name it. There's so many. Tommy Flanagan, you know, so many people that we could name. But I don't hear John Lewis named too often when we're talking about jazz piano. And that's a shame because he's a particularly sensitive and very evocative kind of pianist. We hear him in the background right now. Maybe you can hear him. He's a great pianist, and he was one of the masterminds of the Modern Jazz Quartet. Contributed many of its compositions, along with the great Milt Jackson on the vibraphone, of course. This is mood jazz. What do I mean by mood jazz? This is the kind, if you want to create a certain kind of ambiance, a certain kind of atmosphere, this is the kind of jazz you want to put on if you want to have a quiet dinner with friends and have a nice evening of quiet, comfortable, relaxing music. Nothing too stressful, nothing too strident, just a beautiful kind of mood music. Background music or forward music, doesn't matter, foreground or background, you're going to have a beautiful sound created by the Modern Jazz Quartet. And these guys, they are a bridge, I believe, in jazz. They are truly a bridge between the European culture and the African culture that gave birth to jazz. Because, of course, when we talk about jazz and where jazz comes from, everybody knows that it was created in the United States. More precisely, in New Orleans. Everybody says that jazz was born in New Orleans. Now, what was New Orleans? You have to understand a little bit about New Orleans. New Orleans has got one heck of a history. Now, in New Orleans belonged to France. New Orleans was founded originally by two men from Quebec. That's where I'm coming from right here. Two guys from Montreal. I forget their names now. They were Frenchmen. They went down all the way down to Louisiana, and they founded the city of New Orleans. Okay, you can check that in your history books if you doubt me. It was two Frenchmen from Montreal. And New Orleans belonged to France for quite a number of years. Then it was shifted over to Spain for a number of years. And then Spain, in the end, sold it back and gave it back to the United States. So you had definitely a lot of European culture settled in New Orleans, in Louisiana, because the French, for a certain time, colonized it. And a lot of French people settled there. There's still some French people speaking French in Louisiana. That's why. It used to belong to France a long time ago. Spanish people settled in there also. And of course, there was a lot of black Africans in New Orleans. And this melting pot, or this blending, if you want, of these cultures, well, that's what eventually gave birth to jazz. This mixing, this being exposed to one another, and artistically speaking, shake this up real good, and boom, what came out of it? Jazz. A beautiful thing came out of it. That's what I call the beauty of jazz. That's what I call the beauty of difference. That's what's beautiful about the African culture meeting the European culture, the European instruments, European composition, and all that. They meet, and out of this meeting comes forth a beautiful creation, a beautiful new thing, a beautiful new contribution to the world art called jazz. They really, and the Modern Jazz Quartet illustrates this, they take the best of both worlds and they fuse them together, and it gives this great music that you're hearing in the background. You see, the Modern Jazz Quartet, it's a very contemplative kind of music. When I listen to the Modern Jazz Quartet, it's like a painter that's in front of a great canvas, and he starts to paint, and he starts to make colors appear, and all kinds of things are appearing on that canvas, and your mind just wanders off. And that's what I see all kinds of things. You can see all kinds of pictures when you're listening to the Modern Jazz Quartet. They are a phenomenal group for that. They have an artistic beauty about them that's unique in jazz. Let's put it this way, it's very unique in jazz. Some people will just not like it, and some people will love it. And I think you have to have been exposed to jazz for a while before you can get accustomed to their brand of stuff. But in any case, they are a beautiful bridge between the white European classical tradition and the black African musical heritage. They are sort of a bridge between the two. And a lot of friends that I've had over the years that told me, I remember one friend in particular that used to work with me, he told me he just couldn't get into jazz. He just could not get into jazz. He tried listening to it and all that. This man was an opera fan. He was a fan of opera, of all things. That's not an easy music to get into it itself. He was an opera fan. That's all he listened to. And he says, I've tried to listen to jazz, but he says, I can't get into jazz. And one day while he was at my place, I played some Modern Jazz Quartet. First thing that hit him, he heard Milt Jackson's vibraphone, and he said, whoa, what is that? He didn't even know what the vibraphone was. But when he heard the sound of Milt Jackson's vibraphone, he said, wow, that's really got a nice sound. That's beautiful. That's the first thing he had. And then he listened some more and he said, wow, he says, this group is really, they're really particular. They're saying something beautiful. And I said, yeah, they're the Modern Jazz Quartet. And he says, geez, yeah, I want some of that. Make me a tape of that. You know, that was back in the cassette tape era. He says, make me a tape of that. I want to take that home. I want to listen to more of that. And the Modern Jazz Quartet was his bridge of entry into the jazz world. He started to like jazz when he started listening to the Modern Jazz Quartet. So you see, and he was a classical music fan, an opera fan. The Modern Jazz Quartet went and got him and brought him into the jazz world. So that is the main strength. That was one of the great strengths, I would say, of the Modern Jazz Quartet. But all in all, they have created beautiful, unique, a unique kind of artistry in jazz. They are very much worth listening to. I cannot recommend any bad albums. All their albums are recommendable. Starting 1952, all the way down to their dissolution in 1974, they finally disbanded. And then they reunited on and off over the next couple of years for recordings, sometimes for concerts, sometimes for both. I got one of the recordings that they did in 1988 called For Ellington, where they play all Duke Ellington numbers. They reunited for that briefly, for that recording. Then they disbanded again, and they went their separate ways. But in any case, they officially stopped, I think it was in 1991 or 92. That was the official end, real end of their recording as a unit. But they disbanded in 1974, and then after that we're on and off basic, back together, and then finally until 1992, where they really ceased all activity. And but anyway, all this to say that the Modern Jazz Quartet, this should be on your list. If you want some great mood jazz, you want some classical kind of jazz. These guys were classy. They created a very classy, very classical leaning kind of jazz. Well worth looking into. This here's a great start. This live concert in Slovenia. Back in 1960, they did a world tour. They were on tour in Europe anyway, all over Europe. They did many good recordings were done that same year in 1960 all over European capitals. And the Europeans really dug them, and it's no secret why they really liked them, because in Europe, they were used to, of course, the European classical heritage, and they recognized part of their own heritage being performed in a beautiful, phenomenal way by these four black Americans from the United States called the Modern Jazz Quartet. And they say, wow, this is incredible. Look at this. It's a union of jazz and classical, and it makes beautiful, phenomenal music. So they were very much in demand in Europe, very much appreciated. They would play in concert halls all over Europe. They were not in the clubs. These guys were not playing in clubs. They were playing in concert halls, and people were coming to see them in very, very formal concert settings. And you don't hear anybody whistle. When the applause comes on these live recordings, you don't hear anybody whistling or screaming, yeah, all right, right on, things like that. You won't hear any of that because it's a very respectful, very contemplative, very much respectful and contemplative audience listening to every little bit that's going on with these guys musically. And so there's a lot to hear when you're listening to the Modern Jazz Quartet. There's a lot of great mental paintings to be seen in your mind, in your mind's eye, when you listen to this grand music. I highly recommend these guys, the Modern Jazz Quartet. Anybody out there who wants a different kind of jazz, wants some mood jazz, wants a jazz that will create a very particular kind of relaxed atmosphere in your home, then I encourage you, put on some Modern Jazz Quartet. That's my recommendation for this week, for this little episode. So until next time, as I always say at the end of these episodes, listen to some great jazz music. It'll help you get through this coronavirus craziness, this insane virus that's driving everybody crazy. And don't forget, jazz on, people. Jazz on. Talk to you later.